Thank you for joining us for the presentation of the 2021 Preliminary Operating Budget. This budget presentation is designed to provide the public an understanding on the funding that the division receives, how this funding is allocated, and the effects of the funding on staffing and other budgetary costs. At the end of this presentation, I will also provide additional information on where you may find other budget reports and information. I will also provide details on how you may provide feedback to the division on this year's budget. We will start this presentation with the division's budget process. The budget process starts with getting public feedback through the division's town hall meetings, in which over 200 parents, students, staff, and community members attended. The town hall meeting asked for feedback on two main questions. What resource allocations make the most significant impact to the school experience of students? And what are some new and innovative ideas that the board can think about to maximize resource allocations? To support in these questions, the division provided additional budget and allocation information. This included information on the main pieces of the division's budget for 1920 and a visual representation of many different types of supports that we provide to our students. These infographics provided much of the additional budget and allocation information for the town hall participants to review. These posters were also made available on the division's website and allowed for additional feedback for those who could not attend the town hall meeting. The feedback received through these processes was provided to the board and assisted with establishing the division's priorities. Through the feedback received in the town hall meeting, the board retained the three main priorities of achievement, inclusion, and innovation. Through the budget process, the board priorities guided the division's budget allocations. The feedback also supported the development of the board budget beliefs of that the budget is developed in the best interest of all students, that it is an open and transparent process, to have the staffing to facilitate educational opportunities, that education is the foundation to student success. The budget must provide equitable access to educational opportunities, keeping student fees as low as possible, and having the opportunity for innovative practices. As part of the budget development, student enrollment is a major factor that determines funding and the related allocations. For the 2021 school year, it is projected that the division will have just over 12,000 students, which represents a 2.26% increase or an estimated increase of approximately 266 students. Overall, the division is expecting a slight reduction of approximately 1.23% for elementary student enrollments. Middle schools are projected to see an estimated 6.5% increase in enrollments, and high schools are projected to see an estimated 4.5% increase. The division has seen relatively consistent overall growth in students from year to year and is projecting to see similar growth in future years. This growth is partially due to the growth within the city of Lethbridge. The projected student enrollment for 2020 and future years is estimated using forecasting software and the division's review of grade movements from year to year. Student enrollment is the most significant factor in determining the division's funding. However, as discussed later in this presentation, the funding for growth is somewhat reduced with the new provincial funding framework. Overall, the division is projecting to receive a total of $132.55 million, whereas this results in a 1% reduction in available funding from the prior year. To understand this reduction, we must review the provincial funding changes during 2019 and 2020. To assist in explaining these changes, the division has developed a summary on the changes in provincial funding. Therefore, starting with the 2019-2020 budget, there were some significant effects from the 2019 provincial budget that was announced on October 24th, 2019. This included an overall funding reduction of $6.5 million of grants that were eliminated. To support in this transition, the province did provide one-time transitional grant funding of $2.2 million. During the planning of the 2019-2020 budget, the division had expected the elimination of the SIF funding and did not include this grant in the budget. Therefore, after the effects of the transitional funding and that the division had already planned that the SIF would not be included, the division still faced a $3 million shortfall in funding. This funding shortfall was provided mid-school year, whereas staffing and class schedules were already months underway. Therefore, the division covered the $3 million shortfall with the use of one-time reserves and other applicable savings to minimize the disruptions on classrooms, programs, and services to our students. Now looking at the new provincial funding framework that has been released for the 2021 school year. There were some significant changes to the funding framework, including a reduction in the amount of grants from 36 to 15 grants. These grants are now within 5 major categories, including base instruction, service and supports, schools and facilities, community, and jurisdiction. Most of these grants have changed the determination and allocation of funding and are not comparable to the prior framework. Therefore, it is somewhat like comparing apples to oranges. One of the most significant changes in the new framework is the use of the weighted moving average. Although the weighted moving average does provide a predictable funding model, it does have disadvantages to growing divisions. As shown in the example, based on a growing enrollment, the example has a weighted moving average of 11,300 full-time equivalent students that are being funded. However, in the example, there are 12,000 students that the division would need to serve in the upcoming school year, resulting in unfunded student growth. Some of the additional changes in the funding framework also include that the jurisdictional funding for board and system administration is now completely separated. The program unit funding, or PUF funding, has had a significant change that the program is now only eligible for pre-K students, whereas in the prior year, this funding was also available for kindergarten students. This reduced the funding from $4.3 million in the prior year to approximately $1.7 million. This results in approximately a 2/3 reduction in this funding. The Regional Collaborative Service Delivery Program, or RCSD program, was also eliminated in 2020, in which this program provided the division some direct grant funding and many additional supports for our students. The new Learning Support Grant includes a portion of this PUF and RCSD funding that was allocated within the new funding framework, however, not to the same level of the supports that the division had been receiving through these programs previously. The division, however, did benefit from the changes in the plant operation and maintenance funding, as this new allocation model includes a component based on the utilization of facilities within the division. This resulted in the division receiving an increase of $1.7 million in this funding, which is a targeted grant and must be used for maintenance and operations of its buildings. The budget does include some bridge funding as part of the new funding framework, in which this funding will be reduced or eliminated over the next couple school years. Overall, the changes in the provincial funding framework have significant effects on the division, as approximately 93% of total funding from the division is received from the provincial government. Therefore, when looking at the revenues breakdown between the different types of funding, as noted before, 93% of the revenues are received from the province. The new funding framework has also had the following major effects. There was an increase in student enrollment. However, these increases are limited to the weighted moving averages. There was a reduction in the PUF funding. The RCSD funding and supports were eliminated. A couple of the Making Connection programs were not renewed currently for 2020, and the division had a significant increase in the planned operation and maintenance funding. There is also a significant reduction in the one-time reserve funding that has been used, as the prior year included the additional reserves required to assist in the 2019 grants that were removed, and included some school carry-forward funding for specific projects. The 2021 budget may be updated in the fall for some additional school carry-forward funding if applicable. Through the budget process, the division is planning on using approximately $817,000 of one-time reserves to address the board and school site priorities, including approximately $400,000 to assist with the changes in the funding framework to minimize the effects on the classrooms. $275,000 has been saved and will be used in the upcoming school year for the startup and resourcing costs of the new Southeast Elementary School that is currently under construction and opening for the 21-22 school year. $50,000 is to be used for resourcing the addition of the Grade 4 Spanish program, and additional one-time funding is used for other instructional programming. Therefore, with the total of $132.55 million in available funding, the division can allocate these funds to the applicable programs. So to review the funding allocations, we can look at the comparison of the funding sources from the prior year to support the program allocations. Overall, the division received an increase of $2.29 million in operating revenues, whereas within this increase, a large portion specifically related to the increases in the operation and maintenance funding, accounting for $1.7 million of the increase. The prior year allocations included $4.55 million of one-time reserves to support the mid-year funding adjustment and other specific carry-forward funding for projects. This resulted in an overall reduction of $1.45 million in available funding. The allocation to the programs is a direct result of the changes in the funding sources, including a reduction in instructional allocation of 2.7%, a reduction to administration allocation of 3.8%, and an increase to the planned operation and maintenance allocation of 16.6%, with the increase in these targeted grants. Based on the available funding and allocations, the division is projecting to have expenditures of $132.55 million, balancing these operational budgets. The most significant component to the division's costs are the staffing. As shown in the chart, the division has had both growth in student enrollment and overall staffing levels. However, there is a reduction in the current year budget as a result of this limited funding available. According to last year's survey, the division was considered the third largest employer in the city of Lethbridge, whereas the division spends 56% of the total budget on teaching staff and 21% on support staff. As a result of this limited funding available, the division is planning on a 3.8 full-time equivalent reduction in teaching staff, accounting for a 0.6% reduction. The removal of class size funding in the prior year had a significant effect on the available funding for this area. However, it was a board priority to maintain reasonable class sizes, so the division minimized these effects as much as possible. Note that the majority of this reduction specifically relates to the reduced enrollments in the elementary group. Support staff had a larger decrease of 40.9 full-time equivalent reduction in staffing, accounting for 7.9%. The majority of this reduction specifically relates to a 30.9 FTE reduction in educational assistance. This reduction in educational assistance mostly relates to the kindergarten PUP program. There was also additional reductions in support staffs in the instructional and administrative programs. As shown in the chart, the 30.9 FTE reduction in educational assistance, there was a 45 FTE reduction with EA specifically in the kindergarten PUP program, and a 6 FTE reduction in the early education programs. There was additional EA staffing added in the elementary group through the inclusive learning to support in these areas. Overall, the factors affecting enrollment include increased enrollment, and only the weighted moving averages were funded, the changes in the funding framework, increases in the average teacher cost with staff grid movements and less new teachers being hired, and increases in the average EA costs with staff grid movements. Some additional information relating to staffing. Staffing costs account for 76% of the total budget, in which teaching staff relates to 56% of the budget. Within the instructional program, these distributions are even more allocated towards staffing at 87%. As previously discussed, according to the 2019 survey, the division is the third largest employer within the city of Lethbridge. And the division has been able to reduce our class sizes over the past couple of years, as this has been a priority for the division. However, certain factors outside of the division's control, such as the removal of class size grants, could add challenges in future years. Overall, the division expenditures are directly tied to the available funding and program allocations, whereas 80% of the division's budget is for instructional programs, and a total of 20% is relating to non-instructional programs, including plant operation and maintenance, capital, administration, and transportation. The instructional program is the largest area of the budget, representing over 80% of the entire operating budget. As discussed earlier, the allocation to instruction was limited to the available funding for the division within the new funding framework, such as the use of the weighted moving averages, reduction to the PUF funding, and the removal of RCSD funding, and that the prior year included significant one-time reserves to minimize the effects of the mid-year reductions to these grants. Within the instructional programs, the vast majority of costs directly relate to staffing. Therefore, reductions in funding have staffing implications. As you can see within the different instructional groups, elementary had the largest decrease from the prior year, whereas a portion of these reductions directly related to the reduced enrollment in elementary. However, there was also a reallocation of costs between these groups from the prior year, including that in the prior year, the kindergarten mild moderate educational assistance of approximately $830,000 was included in the elementary group, whereas in the current year, this was reclassified to be within the inclusive learning group so that all educational staff are provided through inclusive learning instead of spread out through separate allocations. This reallocation allowed the division to review the distribution of educational assistance throughout the division based on student needs. After accounting for this reclassification, the elementary schools had a reduction of 4.21%, which mostly related to the reduction of enrollment and balancing growth. The instructional program utilizes an instructional budget committee to allocate funding within the instructional programs, and this committee includes representatives from elementary, middle, and high school. Overall, this committee was able to balance growth with an equitable allocation between programs. After accounting for the weighted moving average enrollment changes in each of the groups, the committee was able to have a consistent effects between each of these allocations, including that schools had a range of 2.3 to 2.49% reductions, whereas all other instructional programs ranged between 3 to 3.98% reductions. Overall, the elementary schools had a reduction in their teaching staff of 4.65 full-time equivalents, or 1.8%, which correlated to the reduction in student enrollment. As previously discussed, the educational assistants were reallocated to inclusive learning budgets. Middle schools had increases to their teaching staff of 2.57 FTE, or 2.6%, and high schools had an increase in their teaching staff of 0.66 FTE or 0.4% as a result of their increased enrollments. However, these were not to the same level as the percentage increase in the schools, as these schools were also funded on their weighted moving averages to correlate to the funding framework. Overall, the schools also had reduction in their supplies from the prior year, as many schools had used carry forward funding for specific purposes and purchases of supplies, equipment, and technology in the prior year. Within the other instructional programs, the majority of the decrease relates to the educational assistance within inclusive learning, specifically relating to the reductions on the PUF programs in kindergarten. There were also reductions in PUF teaching staff, technology costs, and other instructional programs. Inclusive learning did, however, have increases in budgeted costs for consulting for occupational therapists, which these supports were previously provided through the RCSD programs. Administration covers many of the legislative and operational requirements of the division and includes the cost of the Board of Trustees, Office of the Superintendent, Business and Finance, Human Resources, and System Instructional Supports. Overall, administration resulted in a 3.8% reduction in available funding. This included certain support staff reductions, including a reduction in a purchasing staff position and a reduction in the operational health and safety officer position, whereas for OH&S, these responsibilities were redistributed through a management team and a joint health and safety committee approach. There were cost increases relating to contracted services, specifically for insurance and legal costs. As shown in the chart, staffing is a large component within this program as well. Overall, the division uses 3.09% of the budget towards administration, whereas this is lower than the previous year of 3.17 and the historical cap of 3.6%. Plant operation and maintenance covers the division's responsibility for construction, operation, maintenance, safety, and security of all buildings, and includes the costs of maintenance, caretaking, and the capital-related costs within the division. Overall, with the increase in the specific provincial funding, plant operation and maintenance resulted in a 16.6% increase. Between plant operation and maintenance and capital, it accounts for 15% of the total budget. This increase is allocated towards an additional 3.6 FTE of caretaking staff and 2.5 FTE of maintenance staff, which supports this program in having the capacity to maintain the facilities and the staff in preparation of the new elementary school. There was also a significant increase in the estimated costs of building maintenance and insurance costs, as many of these have increased significantly over the prior year. There was also an increase in caretaking supplies, as these were added to the budget for these additional schools. Within capital and debt services, the increase relates to the increases in the infrastructure maintenance and renewal funding that was provided. Transportation includes all activities of transporting students to, from, and between schools. It is provided for students that live over 2.4 kilometers walking distance from their designated school. The increase in contracted services relates to the increase in the projected eligible students. Transportation accounts for 2% of the total budget, and the division transports over 3,600 students each day. In summary, the total of $132.55 million in expenditures can be broken down into the 5 major program areas. As discussed before, Instruction accounts for over 80% of the total budget. Support services in total accounts for 20% of the budget, whereas the majority is from plant operation, maintenance, and capital. These allocations can be shown in a chart, as well as the expenditures by type, indicating that the vast majority of expenses are towards staffing. As part of our budget process, we are looking for public feedback on the budget. We have a quick online form that includes some ratings on the budget and additional comment areas if you'd like to provide more detailed feedback. This form will be available through the QR codes within the budget boards, and a link will be provided on the website. Please note that on our website, within the financial reporting section, includes a lot of additional budget information such as executive summaries and large budget boards that will also have a lot of additional budget information available for you. This feedback survey will be available until Friday, May 22nd, 2020, and the results will be provided to the board for their review as part of the board budget debate, which is at 1 p.m. on Tuesday, May 26th. Thank you for your interest in Lethbridge School Division's 2021 preliminary budget. We will now open up the presentation for approximately 15 to 20 minutes for any additional questions that may have been asked